Welcome. My name is James Snapp Jr., and today I am reviewing the first episode of a program called Bible Secrets Revealed, which was broadcast on November 13th, 2013 on the History Channel. The episode was called Lost in Translation. It began with the claim that a variety of historical and theological perspectives were represented in the program. In case anyone wonders about this spectrum of theological perspectives of the main contributors to the program, here they are. Dr. Robert Cargill is currently an agnostic. Dr. Francesco Stavrakopoulos is an atheist. Dr. Bart Ehrman is an agnostic. He believes that Jesus was a false prophet who expected the end of the world to occur in the 1st century. Dr. Riza Aslan is an Islamic historian. He believes that Jesus was plotting a violent revolution against the Romans. He has also stated that Jesus was a socialist. Dr. Candida Moss agreed with Dr. Aslan that Jesus was a socialist. She also believes that there is very little evidence that Christians were persecuted by the Romans. The narrator's first question was, has the Bible been translated, edited, and even censored so many times that its original stories have been compromised by time? Now, it's generally a good thing to investigate the background of the Bible, and investigating involves questioning, but the narrator's questions throughout this program seem more like accusations phrased as questions. Like when I ask, were the narrator's questions selected, designed, and even inflected so many times in order to insinuate that the Bible is unreliable? Now, early in the show, Dr. Aslan made a claim that when we talk about Scripture, we're not talking about verifiable dates and events. That is only partly true. There are parables, there are parables and poetry in the Bible, but a lot of events in the Bible and the time when they occurred can be verified by archaeological evidence. And the biblical authors themselves sometimes cite specific dates, such as in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3. Dr. Cargill followed up on Dr. Aslan's comment by saying that the Bible is basically anonymous. But that is only partly true. Some Old Testament books plainly identify their authors. The names of all 12 minor prophets in the Old Testament appear at the beginnings of their books. About 5 minutes into the program, we meet archaeologist Dr. Robert Mullins, who stated that in Genesis chapter 5, verse 2, the word Adam, or Hebrew Adam, means the entire human race, not a single individual. You might already have seen Dr. Mullins in Ancient Aliens, which is another Prometheus entertainment show. In case you're wondering if Kevin Burns, the executive producer of Ancient Aliens, is also the executive producer of Bible Secrets Revealed, the answer is yes. Now, when someone casually reads Genesis chapter 5, verse 2 in the King James Version, it may indeed seem as if Adam and Eve were both named Adam. What we're looking at here is a transliteration. The translators probably resorted to a transliteration, in other words, putting the Hebrew word just into English letters. They probably resorted to a transliteration in order to avoid putting too fine a line on the interpretation of this term. The context in Genesis 5 indicates the limits of the meaning of Adam go beyond what would be implied by representing it as the entire human race. In the next 3 verses, Adam lives, Adam reproduces, Adam names his son Seth, and Adam dies. The entire human race does not reproduce or name its son Seth, and the entire human race does not die in the course of the passage. So a strong case can be made for retaining the transliteration, and when the question comes up, what does this mean? That's when the preacher or the teacher or the commentator should speak up and explain the nuance involved. Plus, it's not as if the less literal rendering proposed by Dr. Mullins is anything new. Not only was it adopted in several recent translations, but even in the 1530 Tyndale Bible. In Genesis 5:2, Adam was translated as man. Next, the program moves along to 1 Samuel, to the account of the duel between David and Goliath. Dr. Cargill pointed out that in 1 Samuel 17:50 and again in 17:51, David slays Goliath. But in 2 Samuel 21:19, a man named Elhanan is listed as the person who killed Goliath. So we face two questions. How is it that David slew Goliath twice, and who really killed Goliath? Well, the first question projects a level of technical precision upon the text that it was not intended to have. If a murderer gave someone a fatal dose of poison, and then as the victim was gasping for breath, the murderer pushed him off a cliff, and then he shot him as he was falling, at what point does the act of slaying occur? When does it begin and when does it end? Well, in ancient Hebrew, if somebody said that a person was slain after he received a fatal blow, even if a second blow removed all doubt that he was dead, no one would argue the point. The answer to the question, who killed Goliath, is not that the story is a historical mistake. When we look into 2 Samuel 21:15 and 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 4 through 5, we see that Elhanan fought the Philistines when David was an older man. Much older. What David did and what Elhanan did were two different events that were decades apart. Just look at the context. What we're dealing with here are scribal mistakes. It is extremely clear from 1 Samuel chapter 17 that David killed Goliath. 1 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 5 says that Elhanan, the son of Jair, killed Lami, the brother of Goliath. And 2 Samuel 21:19 says that Elhanan, the son of Jair, Oregon, killed Goliath. How do we resolve this? The explanation given in the NET, the New English Translation, is instructive. The Chronicles text, it says, has misread Bethlehemite as the accusative sign followed by a proper name. Meanwhile, the Samuel text misread the word for brother as the accusative sign, thereby giving the impression that Elhanan, not David, killed Goliath. Thus, in all probability, the original text read, Elhanan, son of Jair, the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath. So it's somewhat technical, and it involves Hebrew and that sort of thing, but the situation is not that someone attributed David's victory over Goliath to Elhanan, or Elhanan's victory over Goliath's brother to David, or that Goliath got better. The whole question is settled by an accurate reconstruction of the original Hebrew text. The next question that was raised was, why was the New Testament written in Greek? Dr. Stavrakopoulos said that the authors were going to get more money by writing in Greek, and that they were not interested in how many Jewish people became Christians. She said they want Romans with money. Well, the insinuation that the authors of the New Testament wrote in Greek due to a financial motive is nonsense. They wrote Greek because Greek was the language in which they could write and which their readers could read. In addition, the Gospel of Matthew is designed for Jewish readers. The book of Acts states that Paul made special efforts to evangelize Jewish communities. And the early writer Papias mentions that Matthew wrote down Jesus' sayings in the Hebrew language. The suggestion that the Christians' use of Greek was financially driven was some kind of snub against Jewish people, when Jewish people were also speaking and writing in Greek and were routinely using a Greek translation of the Old Testament, is baseless. But that's a small exaggeration compared to the next insinuation. After viewers were introduced to the Emperor Constantine, who legalized Christianity in the early 300s, the narrator asked, "An emperor authoring the Bible?" And at this point, I have to ask, did Kevin Burns take this subject seriously? Constantine did not write the Bible. Constantine was not baptized until shortly before his death. When we look at the early New Testament papyri, such as Papyrus 45, Papyrus 46, 66, and 75, we are looking at manuscripts that were made before Constantine was even born. The idea that Constantine was the author of a single word of the Bible is preposterous. The program's second segment focused on the stories about Jesus' birth in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Dr. Aslan stated that the childhood nativity stories that we find in Matthew and Luke are full fictions. That's interesting, coming from someone who calls himself a Muslim, because the Quran in Surah 19 summarizes some of the same events that are in the nativity stories in Luke. How does something that's fiction in the Gospels become truthful in the Quran? Next, the program targeted the translation of the Hebrew word alma as virgin in Isaiah 7:14. The show used some graphics that were made to look like quotations directly from a Bible. I won't explore every aspect of this question today. It's been addressed in lots of commentaries, but we can at least explore two questions. First, when Isaiah used the Hebrew term alma, did he refer to a young woman or to a virgin? And second, what does this have to do with the conception of Jesus? These questions can be answered in 3 steps. The first step is to acknowledge that while this term basically means a young woman who is of marriageable age, just as Dr. Stavrakopoulos said, in the time of the prophet Isaiah, virginity was the expected condition of respectable young women of marriageable age. The second step is to take the time to read Isaiah chapter 7 and notice that Isaiah's primary purpose was not to describe a supernatural conception. Isaiah was simply starting a countdown by saying that by the time a young woman, who was presumably a virgin up until then, by the time she conceives and bears a child, and the child grows old enough to know right from wrong, the invasion threat posed by the neighboring countries of Israel and Syria will disappear. The third step is to see that there's nothing in Isaiah 7 that would naturally make anyone in the first century think that Isaiah's words applied to Jesus. So why did Matthew and Luke interpret Isaiah 7:14 as a text that has a bearing on the conception of Jesus? And the answer is that they already had received, directly from their sources, a report that Jesus had been conceived of a virgin. Luke practically identifies Mary as his source for this information when he mentions that Mary treasured all these things in her heart in the Gospel of Luke chapter 2, verse 51. Matthew and Luke, after being informed by earlier testimony that Jesus had been conceived in the womb of the Virgin Mary, scanned the Old Testament for examples of similar acts that fulfilled a pattern of divine activity. They looked for similar signs that God is with his people, and they found one in Isaiah 7:14. Matthew found it in the Septuagint version, the Greek version of Old Testament books that was undertaken in the 200s BC and was gradually expanded. In the Septuagint, in Isaiah 7:14, the Hebrew word alma was translated into Greek as parthenos, which means virgin. This is what Dr. Stavrakopoulos called a mistranslation. But this wording was not invented by Christians. The Septuagint was made by Jewish translators over 2 centuries before Jesus was born. Now, according to Dr. Jeffrey Gagan, who appeared briefly near the end of this episode, the Septuagint is an excellent tool that Bible scholars use to determine the Vorlage, or earliest writings. And the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls gave an incredible boost to the legitimacy and accuracy of the Septuagint. Now, I do not want to give the impression that everything in the Septuagint is accurate, but if the narrator had repeated those statements, this segment of the episode could have had a lot more balance. It would have conveyed a completely different impression. Instead of seeing only the assertion that virgin is a mistranslation, viewers would have been told that virgin is how Jewish scholars, long before the birth of Jesus, translated the Hebrew term alma in the Greek Septuagint, an excellent, accurate tool that is used by scholars to determine the original text. The narrator proceeded from the book of Isaiah to the Gospel of Mark. The narrator raised a question about the reliability of the stories of Jesus, but in the interview that followed, the only controversy was about how to translate one phrase in Mark 2:28. Once again, a misleading graphic was used. It made it seem as if it's normal for Bible translations to replace the term Son of God with Jesus, but that's not true. Nor is it true that in the Gospels, Son of Man means a dude. Dr. Carville and Dr. Ehrman encouraged the interpretation that when Jesus used the phrase Son of Man, he meant human beings in general. But if Mark had wanted to convey that idea, why not just record the saying as, man is Lord of the Sabbath? Son of Man is a term that Jesus uses in the Gospels to refer to himself. In Mark chapter 2, is Jesus speaking about just any dude when he says that the Son of Man has power to forgive sins? In Mark chapter 9, is Jesus speaking about just any dude when he tells Peter, James, and John not to tell anyone about the transfiguration until the Son of Man had risen from the dead? Is Jesus speaking about just any dude in Mark 10:32 through 34, when he says the Son of Man will be betrayed and scourged and killed and will rise from the dead? Well, no. Mark plainly says in verse 32 that when Jesus said this, he was telling his followers the things that would happen to him. The next Bible secret was about the ending of the Gospel of Mark. In two Greek manuscripts from the 300s, the text of Mark stops at chapter 16, verse 8, and does not contain verses 9 through 20. Not one contributor mentioned the anomalies in the format of the end of Mark in those manuscripts, nor did they mention any of the evidence from early writers who support the inclusion of those verses, even though some of that evidence is older than those two Greek manuscripts. Dr. Aslan claimed that someone added 8 more verses to the Gospel of Mark. Would it be too much to ask that we could hear from a researcher who has at least noticed how many verses are in Mark 16, 9 through 20? Did any one of the contributors reveal that the inclusion of Mark 16, 9 through 20 is supported by Codex Alexandrinus, and Codex Washingtoniensis, and Codex Bezae, and by over 1,600 other Greek manuscripts? No. They kept that Bible secret a secret. I have investigated this subject, and not only have I concluded that lots of commentators, including Bruce Metzger, have spread false claims about these verses, but I also believe that these 12 verses belong in the text. But even if a person prefers the text in two Greek manuscripts from the 300s, instead of the text supported by evidence from the 100s, it's clear from Mark chapter 16, verse 6, that, lost my place, that the teaching that Jesus arose from the dead is not the consequence of a missing page. In that verse, the woman who visited the empty tomb are told, "You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him." The next Bible secret involved John 7:53 through 8:11. This is another 12-verse passage which, as Dr. Ehrman said, is not in our earliest manuscripts of the New Testament. What Dr. Ehrman kept secret, and what is never mentioned in this episode, is that in almost 1,400 Greek manuscripts these verses are included, and that Jerome, in the late 300s, said that he had found many manuscripts, both Greek and Latin, that contained this passage. There is a legitimate text critical question about John 7:53 through 8:11, and it would take another whole lecture just to take a tour of the evidence about this. But there is something I want to show you from the 30th minute of the show. After Dr. Ehrman said that this passage is in John chapter 7 and 8, and after Dr. Moss proposed that the events in the story probably never happened, like she does about a lot of events in ancient history, an animated graphic showed these verses disappearing from a page of the Bible. Now, if that had been all that was shown, then the disappearance would have stopped here. That's John 7:53, this space here. This is where the verses that are in question were. The thing is, in the show, all the verses in chapter 7 that come before these 12 verses also disappear. Cue the narrator. Does this display of the complete disappearance of John chapter 7 show that the people who made this program intended to deceive their viewers? Or does it demonstrate that they did not possess basic familiarity with the text? The last 15 minutes of the program focused mainly on misinterpretations of the Bible. The accuracy of the text itself was not much challenged. But this portion did have a few interesting moments. One of them came when Dr. Aslan asked, why is it that 5,000 years after these stories were written, we still read them, we still believe in them? Now his question is problematic in two ways. First, Dr. Aslan clearly does not believe the Bible. He's not a Christian. He said that the Bible stories about the birth of Jesus are full fictions. And second, what was meant by 5,000 years after these stories were written? The New Testament was written less than 2,000 years ago. All of the Old Testament books were written after 1,500 BC. Dr. Aslan's description of basic Bible chronology is remarkably inaccurate. It's off by at least 1,500 years. If he can't get that right, why is he on the show? Now, there were a few other mix-ups in the program that I have not mentioned, but I want to move along and share some final thoughts about the show. Aside from examinations of passages that involve textual criticism and discussions of misinterpretations, this show alleges that one word in Genesis 5:2, one word in Isaiah 7:14, and one phrase in Mark 2:28 have been lost in translation. That's the extent of the alleged mistranslations in this episode, and for each one a strong case can be made that the allegation is incorrect. The inaccuracies, misrepresentations, and sensationalistic tone in this program are not only unworthy of their subject, but are alien to serious scholarship. The television program Bible Secrets Revealed, Lost in Translation, was broadcast on the History Channel, copyright 2013, A&E Television's networks, and was produced by Prometheus Entertainment, copyright 2013. I have cited its contents here as part of a review. Thank you for watching.